Hello, welcome to Paper 1 Education of AQA GCSE Sociology. Before you begin, you may want to consider whether you have the following equipment ready: paper, notepaper, coloured pens, pencils, ruler, your revision guide, your easy guide, and anything else that you may need to complete your revision. You might want to consider how you set out your paper, perhaps a spider diagram for functionalist, feminist, Marxist and interactionist views. You may want to use alternative headings. You may want to put your paper into 4 sections, talking about the types of school, the measuring and recording of results within education, the theoretical perspectives, and the social stratification of education. Once you've filled each section, that means you can keep your notes nice and concise and only put down the important parts. Lastly, make sure you've got a cup of tea on hand, that you're ready to pause and take breaks before you begin. The function of education. The question of why do we have schools is really important. If you think about the time when Marx was writing, and even before then, schools were really for the very richest in society. Children were expected to go out and work from a very young age. So compulsory state education, where governments decided that children must be educated, they're relatively new, but incredibly important. Durkheim said that the major function of education is the transition of society's norms and values. And when he's writing in 1925, not a lot has changed since then, you may argue. Functionalists particularly believe that the whole point of education is to help you fit in. It's to help you see where in society you belong and what you can do. So there's 4 main functions of education, similar to the family, and the real question, which Durkheim and Parsons later builds on, is social cohesion. Does education provide it? You will be forced to be educated alongside strangers, essentially, people that might be from your community, but you wouldn't know otherwise, perhaps. So you have to learn to work together. The other element of education is, does it equip people for future employment? Functionalists would argue it does, undoubtedly. Many critics of education would say, a lot of what you learn in schools is completely irrelevant to you and your job. Obviously, if you think about GCSE, General Certificate of Secondary Education, the idea of education at high school is to be general, is to give you as many different skills and for you to specialise in your job later on. This is the idea of Parsons and the school being a bridge between family and meritocracy, so kind of combining. The hidden curriculum teaches you how to fit in and takes over from your family on a day-to-day level, and then the school delivers you the education and the knowledge so that you can achieve the status you deserve. Therefore, you may think about education as being part of a value consensus. It may give you a role, and it should be meritocratic. If you work hard, you get the best exam results and the best jobs. That's essentially the functionalist view. Schools as an agency of socialisation. Well, schools are an agency of informal social control more often than not. And part of that is being taught how to fit in different peer groups, the social hierarchies in school, in the classroom, out in the playground. It's a form of secondary socialisation where perhaps the core values of a school, whether that's a faith school, whether that's an academy like ours, whatever it might be, can radically influence how the teachers do their jobs, how the kids respond to the teachers, how the kids respond to the rules of the school. Therefore, you may see meritocracy, or you may not. You may argue that a school might have the intention of teaching kids and bettering them, but it might not be able to do it, or it might deliver education in a way which prohibits meritocracy. So one of the debates you want to talk about in terms of socialisation is, what do kids come out as at the end? Are kids simply taught to all be the same, or are they given the opportunities and they make the choices? And that's again where we have links to the family, as we've discussed already. So when you're talking about an agency of socialisation, think of things simply like school rules, expectations, turning up on time, wearing a uniform, not shouting out, taking part, completing specific tasks in the classroom, at home, whatever it may be. And if you don't do that, there are sanctions. There may be sanctions from your peer group, there may be sanctions from your teachers, there may be social sanctions. So think about socialisation in terms of how does it mould our thinking and behaviour whilst we're at school. Education and capitalism. So remember, capitalism is the system that we live in our society and in many societies. You get a job, you're paid for your labour, you earn your money, we buy and sell things. So if we go back to the idea that functionalists argue education gives us the skills for our jobs, surely it has a massive role to play within capitalism. If education is here to train the workers of tomorrow, that's crucial for the future of capitalism. Obviously, Marxists would be very interested in this and very critical of this. And here we see the correspondence principle from Bowles and Gintis. This was a study done in America, so you may want to think about that in your essays and your questions. How applicable is it to Britain? Regardless, the idea that capitalist societies, big business if you like, or any business demands certain skills from its workers means that education changes. So vocational subjects, where people are taught a specific skill for certain jobs, you may think of child development, health and social care, for example. That type of education comes in and out of fashion. There's big focuses on it some years, less focuses on it other years. And that may be why Bowles and Gintis talk about capitalism and talk about the idea of school reflecting the workplace. You have to wear a uniform, you have to turn up on time, you have to do as you're told. From a Marxist point of view, you have to be docile and passive and good workers, because that's what your boss is going to want of you for the next 40, 50, 60 years. Therefore, Marxists see this direct correlation, this reproduction of labour, this correspondence principle. And finally, the last thing that you may want to talk about with Bowles and Gintis with Marxism is that meritocracy is a myth to a Marxist. You don't really get any further forward. If it was a completely level playing field, it wouldn't matter what school you went to, and it wouldn't matter your class, your gender, your ethnicity. All of those things would be irrelevant because it would be purely down to your schoolwork, what job you ended up with, and how well you did in life. So that's a great play to work with in essays when it comes to comparing, say, Parsons or Durkheim with Bowles and Gintis. Different types of school. One thing you may be tested on the exam is knowing the different types of school. Obviously, this is a key thing you'll need to go and revise. Where you see the term state school, that means the government has funded that school in some way, either completely or partially. So a faith school may have a religious doctrine attached to it, a religious outlook, and it will have funding from a religious organisation as well as the government. An academy obviously will be funded by the government and by an external sponsor of some sort, a company, a charity. Before then, comprehensive schools, schools for everyone, were the other names for state schools. So a lot has changed because academies are relatively new forms of school. You've had free schools come into existence too. You'll also need to talk about selective education and private education. Remember, the 1944 Butler Act talked about, or brought in, I should say, the 11+ exam. Children were selected based on their exam results to go to certain schools, grammar, secondary, modern, technical schools, etc. Private education, you were selected by wealth, and perhaps by entry exam too, but usually if you're willing to pay, you get in. So there's an idea around class there. And the reason some people will send their children to private education is shown in the graph below, as well as the picture. You associate with certain people who have access to wealth, to resources, to a social network. You also get better exam results. If you're paying for results, essentially, you're more likely to get them because the school will do everything they can to get you that value for money, and will have the resources, the teachers, the staff, etc. to do that. So there are many arguments around state school and private school, around meritocracy, and here again is where functionalism and Marxism clash, and that's something that you want to keep in mind and put into each essay, put into each question where relevant. Alternative education. Essentially, this is anything which fits outside of school or schools as a whole. Any of the things that we talked about previously will not be included in alternative education. So the concept of deschooling came about in the 20th century, and it was argued that actually school is really harmful for society, it's really harmful for people. therefore it needs to be rejected. This combines with the idea of homeschooling. Homeschooling, you may remember, was very popular in America amongst very devout Christians, very literalist Christians, because of their beliefs around the teaching of science clashing with the Bible. But there are many types of people that will be homeschooled for many different reasons. Disability, behaviour, cultural beliefs, could be many different reasons. So be careful not to just generalise in the exam. You may want to take into account all of these different reasons where relevant. Then you have schools such as Summerhill and Suffolk, which are democratic, based on the principles that the children get to pick the rules, and academic focus isn't the main reason. So the alternative education is anything which doesn't fit into the norm, as it were. So obviously, when you get a question on this, you may be asked, describe deschooling. You give a definition, you explain it, and you maybe give one of the examples that we've talked about. That will be the best way to get all 3 marks. State or private school. We've already discussed this, but essentially in the exam you may be given an item, such as the one on the slide, showing the difference in terms of funding, money spent, exam results, ethnicity, class, gender, whatever it may be of the student body, and asked to compare them and talk about the arguments for and against. Obviously, Marxists would be very critical of private school because it would reproduce class inequality over more and more generations. Functionalists would argue that if you have the money, if you can afford it, send your child there. State school is obviously seen as imperfect by many sociologists and by many social commentators anyway. So the idea that state school is perfect and private school is bad is not what you should be arguing necessarily. You want to consider the pros and the cons. What kind of education would you get from either school? What would be your reason for sending your child to those schools? What would you expect them to get from it? And what might they get from it? What are the benefits? How does that outweigh any negatives? So there's a very good chance you will get an essay question on this, and you will need to discuss class, gender, results, money, wealth, access to teachers, access to knowledge, access to things after school. For example, the friends that you make, the social networks you create, how might that impact your employment? So when you get a question on state versus private, think functionalist versus Marxist, think different social groups, think different social processes, and you'll easily get the marks. Feminism and education. It's really important that you don't lose sight of the feminist perspective in education. Often it may feel like we're just looking at functionalists versus Marxists, but school has gendered subjects. The idea that cooking, for example, at school versus, say, PE or woodwork or child development puts boys and girls in certain scenarios where they're gendered as subjects. Sociology itself is predominantly popular with female students, yet many of the sociologists we look at are male. There's obviously the idea that more women teach than men as well, especially at primary school. So from a very young age, the socialisation of education and the experience of education has a very female look. You might want to link that to previous modules such as family. You may want to link that to social stratification too, because one of the criticisms of feminism is that by only focusing on gender, it ignores ethnicity, it ignores class, and it ignores kind of the intersections of all these other factors in education. Obviously, the big talking point in education has been girls outperforming boys up until very recently across most subjects. As you can see from the graph, that is a trend which carried on well before and long after the dates given. But the mark between girls and boys was huge. Yet, obviously, men get paid more than women is the common trope, the common idea that you want to talk about. Men get better paid jobs, higher status jobs. And this can link back to the family and the idea that if women take a break from their career to have children, they lose out on money, they lose out on pension contributions, therefore it takes a long time to get that money back. There's also the idea of the focus in school being too much on underperforming boys. Do teachers favour one gender over the other, maybe unconsciously? Does all the intervention go towards boys because they underachieve without actually checking the data? Those are arguments that often get thrown around in education, and you may want to link those to feminism. Patriarchy and the expectation that women should grow up, not get a job, but get a husband with a good job, start a family. That's a very 20th century idea which people question and people are very critical of. So Oakley's work on the family can also be linked here to education in that respect. And Oakley, even today, is very critical of the idea of women just aspiring to be housewives. So while we may not study a particular study here or a particular sociologist, all the things you know about feminism come into play as they do with any other module. The new right in education. This is one of the modules where we really pay attention to the new right, and that's because of the work of Ball. There are two studies by Ball that we look at. The first one in 1981, which was a much smaller study and looked at participant observation in the field, down at a comprehensive school, looking at selection and socialisation. Two cohorts in the school, one streamed, one mixed ability. So the outcomes there and what that showed, and the idea that banding by ability is positive for the kids that deserve the best education and the best results. Years later, Ball then worked with Bow and Gervitz and looked at parental choice, the marketisation of education, and what this does. So think about this in relation to labelling. Parents can look at how their child's performing and then ask questions of the school rather than the child. Are the school doing enough? Is the school good enough? Can I afford to send my child somewhere else? Can I afford to move house to be in a better catchment area for better schools? These are things which often come across with the idea of marketisation, and obviously the parents that can afford to do that are the middle and upper classes, the ones that value education, the ones that have greater cultural capital. So the new right work builds on the functionalist work in a very specific direction and would be very, very opposed to Marxism. And again, you may make a comparison with feminism because it looks at class rather than gender. But really what you want to think about here is, what do parents do to give their child the best advantages and the best benefits possible? And you may want to link that back to private school, because the new right sort of look at a gap in between there. Getting the best out of the state education system, essentially, would be one of the things I would consider when talking about the new right. Functionalism in education. We've already talked about the function of education, and that links directly to Durkheim and Parsons, but we revisit them here specifically for the functionalist views. So the ideas of secondary socialisation, family to education to job, cooperation between parents, between staff, between pupils, and the effect of that. Norms, values being driven through schools and education and reflected at home. And again, meritocracy, role selection, value, consensus, all playing a part in the journey through schools. When Durkheim talks about schools providing a context in which children learn to cooperate with people who aren't family and friends, we're looking at secondary socialisation, we're looking at people's first steps outside of the family home, and this makes a great link to the previous module. Parsons' belief that schools are meritocratic is really one that's hugely criticised and easy to criticise, but you may want to look at, well, where's the truth in that? Because working class kids do get good results, they do go to university, they do get good jobs. So it may be a case of, rather than being totally right or wrong, the functionalists may be more right and more wrong depending what time frame we're putting that in. If we go back to 1925 and even 1961, how different was society? How easy was social mobility compared to, say, now? And that's one thing you may want to put into context. You want to look at when were different sociologists writing to really unlock those top marks. Because if someone's writing 40 years later, they've got 40 years worth of hindsight to look at. So really, Parsons and Durkheim, good connections with the family module here, good comparisons, and the ability to show that family and education perform similar roles at different life stages. 0 to 5, you're at home, you're with mum predominantly. Then you go out into the world. Your first steps are in school in a safe environment before you go out into work and the wider world as an adult. Therefore, the criticisms, you may want to place that context there too and look at, well, Parsons and Durkheim are right about this, but you need to consider whatever it may be. That will get you the best marks possible. Strong and weak arguments always. Marxism and education. Obviously, Marxism is very critical of education in all forms for different reasons, but it mostly links to the idea of outcomes, meritocracy, and social mobility. Willis's study is probably the most famous Marxist study on education and the easiest to remember. He's very active by sitting at the back of a classroom and observing and then interviewing working class boys. He shows very clearly how there is a conflict with the education system, how these boys aren't socialised by education, they're socialised by everything but education, their own macho roles that they take on. And education's attempts to suppress that has unintended consequences. That's not good for capitalism, because then you get what Murray calls an underclass, boys at the bottom of society, at risk of falling out of work and onto the benefit system. Willis isn't without criticism either. Obviously, Willis is only looking at specific small groups of boys in one area at one time. His work pretty much ignores the female voice, ignores the work of adults relative to the findings backing up Marxist ideas. Housey, Heath and Ridge is a totally different study 3 years later in 1980, looking at 8,000 males, so a large-scale study, looking at class inequalities in education. So there's a link between what a father does and what a son does. Maybe literally the same job, maybe a family business, but often the same types of businesses, the same types of jobs. So a son may become an electrician rather than a builder, for example. This links directly to how class is reproduced, how class is cultural and is reinforced by education. And it talks about different types of class, the service class, the working class, the intermediate class. So people staying within their narrow structures. Obviously, Marx would have only seen one working class, the proletariat. By now we see Marx is talking in smaller divisions of class, much more close to Weber actually. So we can see here that Marxism has moved away from Karl Marx a little bit, and it also is trying to capture changes in society as well as changes in education. But again, a huge criticism here, and one that feminists would seize upon. We're talking about males being educated to work. That may show us what society was like then. It may also show a huge blind spot in Marxism, and something therefore that functionalists would argue doesn't reflect the whole of society because you're excluding half of it. So using all three ideologies, if you like, all three perspectives, you can get some really good comparisons and really good arguments and criticisms of all three, feminist, functionalist, Marxist, and even bringing in the new right as well. But you probably wouldn't have time to do that in an essay, especially not in great detail. So I would always pick two to compare, and then maybe a third perspective just to bring in at the end to show some difference or some balance to the arguments. The main education acts. There are several education acts going back a long way. The three that I want you to really focus on though are the 1944 Butler Act, the 1988 Education Reform Act, and the various policies and proposals of the 1997 Labour government. Firstly, the Butler Act in 1944 planned for education after World War II had ended. So it really came into effect as the world was changing massively. It brought in the tripartite system, it brought in the 11+ exam, and it set in motion divisions in society from a very young age for everybody, and class divisions, educational divisions, and social mobility divisions. Obviously this wasn't bad for everybody and it wasn't good for everybody, but it's something which is hugely contested and something you can always apply to functionalist, Marxist and feminist perspectives. The idea of kids sitting exams at 11 defining their education for the rest of their lives. The 1988 Education Reform Act, really it's mostly known for the national curriculum. All schools have to teach specific topics in specific subjects. We then see the introduction of Ofsted and the movement towards regulating schools much closer and schools being much more accountable. And this plays into what Ball found with marketisation and the movement towards scrutiny for schools much more around exam results and the provision that they give to students. The 1997 Labour government is a hugely important area because they did so many things to education, and it's beyond the scope of this to discuss all of them. But when Tony Blair was campaigning and won the election, he's talked about education, education, education. The fact that Britain was massively underperforming relative to where British people felt their country was in the world meant that for him, for Tony Blair, education was the way to enact that. So a lot of movement was given towards putting way more people into university, people like myself, to bringing in tuition fees, to making it so that education could be paid for and accessed by everybody in a lot fairer ways. This is hugely debated and contested. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Labour government didn't do everything they set out to because they were so ambitious, and what they did do wasn't as beneficial as it was intended to be. So you may want to look at that in further detail. But many of the policies of the Labour government were about equality, were about access to higher education for everybody, particularly working class students. And you can see this progression from the Butler Act through to the Education Reform Act of '88 through to the Labour government. One thing you may want to talk about is the fact that obviously your exam that you're sitting is a result of education reform. The 9-to-1 GCSEs were brought in recently as a direct response to what was seen as failing standards, to making exams more rigorous and academic, so that your generation has a tougher test, as it were, to access and fight for higher education in a much more rigorous way, as a response perhaps to the 97 government. Those are all the key topics for education on your paper. There are less topics in this module, but there's more depth required, so just be wary of that. You may have noticed there are far less headings, far less bits for you to look at, but they are a lot lengthier. If you have any questions, as always, please put them in the comments, please email them, please leave them on the Google Classroom, please come and find me. Thank you very much for listening to this, thank you very much for taking your revision seriously, and with this in the family module in paper 1, you have 2 really nice modules for comparison. So if you've got this far, you'll have more than enough knowledge, and I'm very confident you'll do very well. Good luck.